Hello, my name is Richard Cowling. I'm an ecologist living at Cape St. Francis, and I've been involved with FOSTA, Friends of the St. Francis Nature Areas, for decades. Welcome to this, the first of a series of presentations on the natural and cultural history of the reserves in the Greater St. Francis area. The 4 reserves seen on your left here occupy about 330 hectares of natural habitat and harbour about 400 species of plant. This presentation is going to focus on describing the vegetation types, the broad patterns of vegetation in the region, a bird's eye view of our reserves. Shown here is a map of the world-renowned Cape Floristic region, an area that has huge numbers of species of animals and plants that live nowhere else in the world. Also shown in the colored polygons are the major coastal vegetation types in the Cape Floristic region. The one that we are interested in, which occurs on Holocene dunes, that is very young, recently deposited dunes, is associated with the bright yellow that we see as an extremely narrow band along the coastline, all the way between Woody Cape and up towards Saldanha Bay. These dunes and the associated vegetation occupy just 1% of the Cape Floristic region. So now let's have a look at them in a little bit more detail. Here we see our vegetation on Holocene dunes in the Cape St. Francis area. Vegetation is colloquially called struntfelt, beach vegetation. And it comprises a mosaic of thicket, species like Kershout, which you can see on the skyline there, and Fanboss, such as the Bloemboss we see in the foreground. Another band of this vegetation occurs in Sedgefield, where sands have accumulated, similar age sands have been deposited, and we can see the similar structure, in fact, even a Bloemboss in the foreground. And westwards towards the Still Bay area and right up towards Cape Agulhassan, the Cape Peninsula, and northwards, everywhere we find this dune vegetation, struntfelt, which is a mosaic of Fanboss and thicket of subtropical affinity. Okay, let's start by having a look at how the different subtypes of vegetation fit into our broad struntfelt ecosystem. And we'll do it by looking at a typical dune landscape. So we have these parallel ridges, dune ridges, with swales in between, or dune valleys. These ridges are extremely well drained, so the soils are quite droughty. Plants get stressed, whereas in the swales, soil moisture is much higher overall because the water table is closer to the surface. So we tend to get dense, closed vegetation, thicket, forest in the swales and Fanboss on the dune ridges. And then the coast, we have a particularly special environment because of the impact of salt-laden winds. So if we're on a dune coast, the soft coast, we have this very sparse vegetation associated with the semi-mobile dunes with an array of species that grow nowhere else. And this is because of the particularly harsh circumstances that plants find themselves in these mobile wind-exposed areas. On the hard coasts, where we have outcrops of Table Mountain sandstone, we have another coastal community, also with a distinctive bunch of species adapted to that harsh environment of salt-laden winds. We also get a lot of wetlands because the bedrock is close to the surface, and this brings water right up to the surface, creating these magnificent wetlands. In the dune swale on the right, which is a fairly broad dune swale, we have thicket, and because the swale is quite broad, fire can get in here, and under unusual or exceptional circumstances, thicket does burn, and the legacy of fire is shown here in the multi-stemmedness of this kaarshout. On the left, we have a much deeper swale, and this topography means that the fire path actually misses these sites, and this enables forests to develop, tall plants, single-stemmed, like this Cape hard pear, and this species is only found in one tiny forest patch in the Tace Bay area. And then on all the slopes of the dune ridges, we have Fanboss, drier, adapted to drier conditions, and extremely prone to regular fires. Fire is an extremely important process in the Strandveld landscape. It is a major consumer of vegetation, and has been part of the system for millions of years. Fire is really important, certainly in the Fanboss, in that it provides an opportunity for species which otherwise you would not see to germinate, flower, and set seed. These are the so-called fire ephemerals. They're often very showy, beautiful plants, and they disappear as the vegetation matures and then pop back again after a fire. Fire is also important for stimulating the germination of many of the Fanboss shrubs which are killed by fire. These seeds, which are stored in the soil, are stimulated to germinate by smoke or the heat of the fire, or both. A good example here is the garlic buchu. You can see the little seedling emerging in the post-fire environment. Thicket doesn't burn with every fire, but it will burn under exceptional circumstances of really hot, dry conditions that have been preceded by a prolonged drought. The foliage dries out to sufficient level that the canopies of Melkhout and Kaarshout will catch alight and burn. Thicket is very resilient to fire. All of the species sprout profusely after fire, as can be seen in this Kaarshout here. Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into the Fanboss component of our Strandveld. The first thing to know is that Fanboss is uniquely characterized as a vegetation type, not by the presence of proteas, but by restios. These are rush-like plants. We can see the beech peg reed species from our area in this photo. And everywhere in the Cape, if you're in Fanboss, you'll find restios. The major component in our Fanboss comprises what are called ericoid leaf shrubs. And these are shrubs with very narrow, small leaves that are rolled back. They're often hard to the touch. And we can see in the top right hand is Blombos. In the bottom left hand side is Dune Felicia, and the bottom center is garlic buchu. These are all ericoids common in our bush. They're killed by fire and germinate from soil stored seed in the post-fire environment. Like all Cape vegetation, we have in our Fanboss a high abundance of bulbs. Many are very showy species, such as this common sword lily flowering in spring. The thicket component of St. Francis Strandveld is dominated by species of subtropical affinity, basically more related to rainforests of the tropics than to Cape Fanboss. Shown here is the kubu bessie, multi-stemmed shrub, the dune olive on the right, which is a species endemic to dunes, and of course the kershout, which is probably the most common thicket species in our veld. There's several other vegetation types in our region that occupy small areas, and we'll deal with them in more detail when we deal with the individual reserves. One of which is grassland, which occupies seasonally moist soils between dune ridges. You can see the dune ridge in the back has got thicket, and this area in the foreground, which gets waterlogged during the wet season, has grassland. Where the water actually gets to the surface in these broad dune swales, we get wetlands of various forms and shapes. As I've said previously, in these fire-protected niches in these deep dune ridges, we get forests with typical single-stem species. And then on the coast, as we've already mentioned, on the hard coast and the soft coast, we get a distinctive coastal vegetation. All of the patterns that I've described can be seen in our nature reserves. Irma Boysen gives wonderful opportunities to see how Fanboss and thicket intertwine. Cape St. Francis has really great views of the ridge, dune ridge swale environments. Seal Point is especially good for coastal vegetation, particularly one of our most unique features, which is the shell shingle vegetation around the wild side. And of course, Seal Bay is excellent for getting up to close up to thicket and forest species. So, summing up, Strandveld ecosystems are restricted to small slivers of young coastal dunes in the Cape region. Strandveld comprises a mixture of fynbos and thicket. Fire, soil, moisture and wind exposure control the vegetation patterns in Strandveld ecosystems, as I've shown you for our case. And finally, these patterns can be seen in our reserves. So check it out, get out there, go and enjoy yourself and see if you can see in the real, in nature, some of the patterns that I've been describing. Thank you very much.